July 1st, 1944. While the world bled on the beaches of Normandy, a different kind of war was ending inside the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire. 730 delegates gathered under the guise of peace, but they were not fixing a broken planet. They were witnessing the largest transfer of wealth in human history. Real empires are not built on battlefields. They are built on ledgers. Bretton Woods was not just a treaty. It was the precise moment the US dollar became the oxygen of the global economy. It allowed one nation to capture the world without firing a single shot. And the terrifying thing about oxygen is that you never realize you are paying for it until the supply starts to run out. Today the debt clock is ticking past $34 trillion. To understand why the ground is shaking beneath your feet right now, you must understand the day the gold standard died and the American standard was born. To see the future, you have to look at the wreckage of the past. Before 1944, the global economy was a crime scene. The collapse of the classic gold standard after the First World War did not just break the markets, it turned nations into predators. It was the era of beggar thy neighbor, a polite diplomatic phrase for a brutal economic reality where countries slashed their currency values to steal trade from their allies. It was a race to the bottom that helped grease the tracks for the Great Depression. Hot money flowed across borders, destabilizing governments overnight. Trade barriers went up like fortress walls, and the global economy suffocated. By the time the delegates arrived at the Mount Washington Hotel in July 1944, the old world was already dead. The United States did not host this conference to save the British Empire. They hosted it to bury it. While Europe was burning, American factories were booming, and more importantly, the United States vaults held 2/3 of the entire world's gold reserves. Gold was the only vote that mattered. Enter the two architects of the New World. On one side sat John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant British economist who saw the trap coming. Keynes proposed a neutral global currency called the Bancor, a unit of account that belonged to no single nation, designed to balance trade fairly so that no country could dominate the others. He wanted a system where both debtors and creditors had to adjust. It was the intellectual choice. It was the fair choice. And that is exactly why it was doomed. Across the table sat Harry Dexter White, the American representative. White was not interested in fairness. He was interested in supremacy. His mandate was simple: replace the British pound with the US dollar and make New York the financial capital of the planet. White's plan was asymmetrical. The burden of adjustment would fall only on the debtors, while the United States, the world's greatest creditor, would have no constraints. The negotiation was a formality. The British were bankrupt, broken by 2 world wars, and desperate for American loans. They had no leverage. A senior official at the Bank of England would later describe Bretton Woods as the greatest blow to Britain next to the war itself, because it marked the absolute transfer of financial power. The United States looked at Keynes's Bancor and politely threw it in the trash. The new system would be built on the dollar. The mechanism they built was elegant and terrifying. Every currency in the world would be pegged to the dollar, fixed and rigid, and the dollar, to give it the illusion of stability, would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. The United States promised that any central bank could exchange their green paper for yellow metal at any time. It sounded like a return to stability. It sounded like a guarantee. In reality, it was a coup. By linking the world's money to the dollar, the United States exported its inflation and imported the world's goods. The world went to bed with a gold-backed system and woke up in a world where the US Treasury was the global central bank. The deal was done, but every deal with the devil has a hidden cost. This system granted the United States a power that no conqueror in history ever possessed. The French finance minister called it an exorbitant privilege, but to the rest of the world it felt like a rigged casino where the house played with counterfeit chips. Imagine you want to buy a house. You go to your basement, turn on a printing press, and create a stack of paper. You hand that paper to the bank, and they hand you the keys. Not because they trust you, but because the entire neighborhood is legally required to accept your basement scraps as payment. That is the magic trick the United States pulled off. While Germany and Japan had to build cars and electronics to earn money, America only had to print it. They could finance their deficits simply by issuing more dollars. But every magic trick relies on misdirection, and in the 1960s, a Belgian economist named Robert Triffin pointed a flashlight at the magician's hands. He identified a fatal contradiction that would become known as the Triffin dilemma. The logic was ruthless. To facilitate global trade, the world needed liquidity, which meant the United States had to constantly pump dollars overseas. To do that, America had to run a balance of payments deficit. But the more dollars they printed and sent abroad, the more the ratio of paper money to physical gold in the American vaults skewed out of balance. It was a mathematical suicide pact. If the United States stopped printing, the global economy would freeze from a lack of cash. If they kept printing, the promise to convert dollars to gold at $35 an ounce would become a mathematical lie. By 1964, the amount of dollars held by foreign central banks officially exceeded the total value of gold sitting in Fort Knox. The United States was effectively insolvent. The smart money in Europe started to notice that the emperor was naked. They realized that the United States was exporting its inflation to them, forcing them to swallow paper, while Washington spent real resources on the Vietnam War and social programs. The system began to leak. In a desperate attempt to plug the holes, the United States and 7 other nations formed the Gold Pool, a cartel designed to manipulate the London market and keep the price of gold artificially suppressed. When that failed to stop the bleeding, the IMF invented a new asset called special drawing rights, or SDRs, essentially paper gold created out of thin air to distract the world from the dying dollar. It was a band-aid on a bullet wound. The trust was gone. By 1965, the French were not just suspicious, they were sending warships to New York to exchange their paper for physical gold. The facade was cracking. It was Sunday night, August 15, 1971. The most popular show on television was interrupted, and the face of President Richard Nixon filled the screen. He did not look like a leader admitting to a bankruptcy. He looked like a corporate executive announcing a strategic pivot. In a speech that would sever the last link between money and reality, he announced that he was directing the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. That was the word he used. It was the most expensive lie in financial history. With that single directive, the United States did not just alter a treaty, it defaulted on the world. For 27 years, nations had stockpiled American dollars, believing they were a valid claim on the gold, sitting in Fort Knox because Washington had signed a contract saying they were. In 18 minutes, that contract was torn up. The gold window was slammed shut, and the foreign central banks holding billions in paper IOUs were left standing in the cold. It was a breach of trust on a planetary scale, but because there was no plan B, and because the world was already drowning in dollars, the system did not collapse. It mutated. This was the birth of the fiat era. Money ceased to be a store of value anchored in the physical world, and became a political weapon anchored in faith and credit. The golden handcuffs were removed. Before 1971, politicians were constrained by physical reality, because if they printed too much money, gold would leave the country. After 1971, the only constraint was the speed of the printing press. The discipline of the ledger was replaced by the expediency of politics. The explosion of the United States national debt began exactly at this moment. If you look at a chart of US debt, it is a flat line until 1971, and then it becomes a vertical wall. The government discovered it could finance wars without war taxes and expand social programs without revenue. They could simply print the difference. The system didn't collapse in 1971, it just became a debt-fueled hallucination, and we have been living in that hallucination for over 50 years. For decades, the dollar was sold as a global public good, a neutral utility like the ocean or the internet, but in recent years the mask has slipped. The weaponization of the financial system through sanctions and the expulsion of major economies from the SWIFT network turned the world's reserve currency into the world's primary geopolitical weapon. This sent a chilling message to every capital city on Earth. If your sovereign reserves can be frozen by a decree from a foreign government, then they are not reserves, they are hostages. Enter the resistance. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are no longer politely knocking on the door of the IMF, asking for a bigger seat at the table. They are building their own table. They are actively constructing an exit ramp from the dollar system, utilizing their own currencies for trade, especially in the critical energy sector, where the petrodollar monopoly is beginning to fracture. The numbers confirm the exodus. The numbers confirm the exodus. At the turn of the century, the dollar accounted for over 70% of global central bank reserves. Today, that number has collapsed to under 60%, the lowest level in 2 decades. While Western investors are distracted by stock market rallies, the central banks of the global south are quietly buying something else. They are accumulating gold at a pace not seen since the 1960s. Why would they trade high-yielding US treasuries for a shiny rock that pays no interest? Because gold has no counterparty risk. It cannot be printed by a desperate politician, and it cannot be turned off by a sanction. The United States is now trapped in the final terminal stage of the Triffin dilemma. With the national debt screaming past $34 trillion, Washington faces a binary choice. Default on the debt, which destroys the economy, or print the money to pay it, which destroys the currency. This is not abstract macroeconomics. This is the reason your grocery bill is rising. This is the reason your savings are melting. Inflation is not an accident of the market. It is a feature of a system that must devalue your labor to service its own mistakes. History is a wheel that never stops turning. The Dutch guilder ruled the 17th century. The British pound ruled the 19th. And now the dollar is facing its 1944 moment. But this time, when the music stops, the United States is not the one holding the gold. Systems do not break by accident. They are reset by design. Bretton Woods was the architecture for the 20th century. But architecture has become obsolete. We are currently living through the demolition phase of that old order, to make way for the design of the 21st. Look at the chart of the US dollar's purchasing power since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. It is not a fluctuating line. It is a perfect downward slope, heading with mathematical certainty towards zero. We are now dangerously close to the bottom. The elites who built this system are not waiting for the crash. They are quietly moving into hard assets, real estate, and gold, while the public is distracted by the noise of the market. They know the rules of the game are changing. The only question remaining is, do you? If you can see the patterns while others see only chaos, you are already surviving. If this investigation gave you a missing piece of the puzzle, press the number 1 in the comments below. Subscribe to Financial Money History to decode the next chapter of the hidden game. The truth is cold, but it is the only way to stay warm in the coming winter.